Welcome to Stephen Frain's Sister podcast. Joyce Bruggeman is with us. She's the executive director for Survivors of Suicide Loss organization in San Diego. Joyce is actually in San Diego, and I'm speaking to her from Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us, Joyce. We're very excited to have you on our podcast.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to sharing what we do.
So, to start off, Joyce, who started the organization and how long has it been around? Can you give us a little history?
Yeah, actually, it's pretty unique. We have been around since February of 1981. Two women, Laura Faticky and Dorothy Godfrey, they had both lost loved ones to suicide, and they started going to a support group for people who had experienced a traumatic death. It was sponsored through the Episcopal Community Services. But very, very shortly, they realized that others in the group could not deal with suicide. And so within 1 month, they started their own meeting that was specific for survivors of suicide loss. So pretty unique that an organization like this has been around for 38 years.
Yeah, I mean, I lost my brother in the 80s, so I really wish we had I'm from Northern California, so I really wish I had known about something, my parents had known about something like this
Mhm.
then. Um, do you mind sharing with us your personal loss?
Yeah, so I lost my husband, Ken, to suicide in January of 2008. His suicide followed a 12-year battle with clinical depression. And the root of his problem, which is why I do the work that I do, was that he lost his father to suicide when he was just 16 years old. But in society at that time, you didn't talk about suicide. And so it became this open secret within the family. It was never even discussed. He had never dealt with the trauma of the suicide. And actually, what precipitated his depression didn't happen until we'd been married for 16 years. And what had happened is my father passed suddenly and unexpectedly. And my father had become a surrogate father to him. And it was just that catalyst for the reopening of that deep wound that had never been dealt with. And so what followed was 12 months of a pretty significant clinical depression, more than one suicidal breakdown. And so after he passed, I was actually working at a local university here, Cal State San Marcos.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had a burning desire to do more work in the mental health field and suicide prevention. And I'll be really honest with you, at first I kind of went, well, it seems so reactive. Like I'm such a proactive person. I was like trying to get ahead of it. Like you get ahead of suicide by dealing with the mental health. And then as I started contemplating and looking at the job, it was kind of like the light went on. I'm like, this is proactive for those people who have lost someone to suicide. If Ken had gotten this kind of support, if his family had gotten this kind of support, there's a good likelihood that I would not be living the life I'm living today. And so when I began to realize that effective postvention support is such effective suicide prevention work, postvention is becoming more and more highly regarded as some of the most effective suicide prevention work we can do.
What's so interesting about that is that when I went through my divorce, it re-triggered everything. It
Yes.
re-triggered, and I didn't feel well. I didn't feel good again until I actually went to one of your meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And I could not believe, and they could not, I remember sitting in that room and people couldn't believe how long it had been
Mm-hmm.
since my brother passed. They thought it happened like last month or something, they were like, it's so raw. And it's because it was never dealt with. This is one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast, because the survivors need an outlet, because you're very susceptible. You're very susceptible. And I lost my brother when I was 15, but then tragedy happens and you're opening it up all over again because you haven't dealt with it properly. So I know firsthand how powerful your organization is. And I think one of the things when I first moved to LA that I struggled with is there's nothing here that's like it. But ever since I've been doing this, I've been feeling strong and better again because we're talking about it and we're
Yeah,
discussing it. Um,
exactly.
do you have any children?
I do. I have two adult children. They were 20 and 25 when their father took his life. Devastating. I mean, very, very hard for them. And I remember standing, at the edge of Ken's suicide and thinking, oh my gosh, my son looking at me and saying my grandfather and my father have now taken their lives.
Right.
And I'm like, wow, how are we going to do things differently? Right. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
saw what didn't work. And I don't blame anybody because nobody knew any different back then, right? I mean, we know a lot more about trauma and the impact it has on us now. And so the only thing I knew what to do is just to do it differently and to not be afraid to talk about it. And I'll be honest that they didn't immediately embrace, the healing journey. And I have to explain to people within the groups, sometimes what we just have to do is focus on our own healing. And then those in our lives, we will carve a path for them when they're ready. We'll be
Mm-hmm.
farther down that road and we'll be able to reach back. And that's what's happened with both of my children. Um, they're both doing really well, and I'm grateful for that. But it has been really difficult for both of them. And I have also recognized through SOSL, which has been a gift for me, is to understand how different it is to lose a parent than it is to lose a spouse, than it is to lose a sibling or a child.
Mm-hmm.
Each suicide loss carries such unique challenges. I don't like people comparing them. I think they're all unique and challenging. But it's nice to be able to talk to other people who've experienced that same kind of similar loss and to understand what are some of those challenges that maybe somebody who's experienced a different kind of loss doesn't experience in the same way.
What do you think is one of the biggest problems that survivors such as us face, like right after it happens? What do
It's
you?
always guilt. I
Okay.
think I think guilt is almost universal. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so for me, I didn't experience a whole lot of guilt initially with my husband's suicide because I knew how much work I'd done to try to keep him alive, and how
Mm-hmm.
I'd done a lot of front loading. That doesn't happen for a lot of survivors. But even if you don't have that initial guilt, like when it was time for me to start a new life, then I started feeling guilt. Do I deserve a new life after everything that's happened? So I think most survivors on some level have to struggle with guilt. And I would say the two relationships that seem to exhibit the most guilt are parents who've lost a child
Mm-hmm.
and children who've lost a parent. There's something about the child parent relationship that um, just really triggers that guilt. And then the other thing, and I'm sure you're familiar with this too, is there is just a churning, that question of why, people just doing that wrestling. And until people can, we never really know why, but until people can create a narrative or come to a place of understanding, maybe they'll never know why, they will struggle with that. And it'll be such a churning. And I used to try to help people, give them information and help them until I sat back and I realized that intense struggle is part of the healing journey for a survivor of suicide loss. And as
Well,
much as I want to make it easier for them, they've got to do it. They've got to go through that painful struggle. And that's where the groups are so helpful because they've got the freedom to go through that struggle and hear other people who've gone through that struggle and see where other people have um, come to peace or come to a place of acceptance that they're never going to know the why and choose to move on anyway.
one of the things that we've talked about on this podcast several times is that there's not enough for children, and it's so interesting that you
Yes,
are bringing up that children are so affected by their parents' loss, and I just think that there needs to be more outlets for children. I mean, it seems to be a lot in prevention. There seems to be more for survivors that are adults, but what about survivors that are kids?
that is a very challenging place. And so, you know that our groups are mostly led by just fellow survivors. So, most of them are not mental health professionals. And so, the reason we don't have groups for children is because we really believe strongly that children need to be guided by a mental health professional, because we never want to do more harm. Why? We always want to do good. And something could get triggered in a meeting, and it really requires professional oversight. So I think there's some unique challenges in providing that support. I think it's really identifying mental health professionals who understand suicide. But we have a great resource that we can offer to everybody. It was written by two licensed clinical social workers, and it's a book that people can get on Amazon, and it's called Supporting Children After a Suicide Loss. And it is one of the most simple books. I bet it is not over 35 pages long. And what it does is it helps give parents how-to's language to talk about the suicide, to be open and be honest and truthful, but at age appropriate and not giving too much information. The problem that a lot of parents have about talking to their children, they think they need to give all of the information to the child, and they don't. Children are easily assuaged by just, the very basic things. So, for example, we talk about when you talk with a very young child who maybe has lost a family member to suicide, the verbiage that they use is they say, well, you've heard of a heart attack. That's when somebody's heart doesn't work well. Well, Joe's had a brain attack. He had something wrong with his brain, and it caused him to end his life. He had a brain attack. It just simple language. Most of the time, kids aren't going to ask anymore. But the beautiful thing about that is they get older and they have more questions. Then you've already told them the truth from the beginning, and you haven't gotten into all that deep, dark stuff that, confuses people about how they did it. But this book takes you through the different age levels and how to speak with children, and that it's okay if the child asks a question that you're not, quite ready to answer because you don't know. Because I used to consult with my own mental health professional before I would respond to my kids sometimes. It's okay to say, that's a great question. I'm going to answer that, but I need to think about that for a little while. So you don't have to answer every question in the moment, but you do have to go back and answer it. And what that does is it creates these open, honest conversations. Because I will tell you, I still have different conversations with my kids who are now adults, 11 years later. And those conversations change, and we add more to it because it's a conversation that will span their lifetime just because of the nature of suicide.
What's interesting about what you're saying, though, is I don't think there's enough education for parents to
Absolutely.
how they should do this with children. And I love what you're saying about the different stages. And I have actually heard about this book.
It's
I
excellent.
think Ann Moss brought it up on one of our podcasts, our earlier podcasts when we interviewed her. But I do really believe in this, and I think it is a education for parents or older siblings to understand the different stages. Because I can tell you, as a teenager, I went to a psychiatrist after my brother passed, and it did not help me at all. Not at all.
Okay.
And I think that the reason being is because the person was so detached. They were so clinical. There was no emotion. And something about being in a group with emotion is what I felt like I needed. Like this guy was just, I don't know, I just felt like he just didn't care. But I get your point about how it is challenging with children. But now that we have more resources and we're talking about it more, hopefully we can kind of start to bring those conversations.
Absolutely. And so while we don't have programs for children, that's why it's important for parents to be plugged into groups, because they can learn from other parents about how they dealt with it, and things that they've gone through with their kids and the conversations they've had. So we do that. We also do allow some teens to join our groups. I have a caveat. I tell the parents they have to come to a group first and see what goes on, and then they have to accompany their teen, because we want them responsible for anything that might get triggered with that young person. The other thing I would say really clear, what I have found in finding mental health professionals post-suicide, if you can find someone who actually says that they deal with suicide grief, it's going to be a far more effective outcome, because not all mental health professionals understand grief or the traumatic grief of suicide. And being disconnected, exactly what you explained, is one of the most hurtful things that can happen, because we need to be validated in this deep pain. And when you feel like you're invalidated, it's horrible. It disconnects you from ever trying to explain it again, right?
Right.
So I think that I always tell people to look for people who are trained in trauma and grief.
That's really good advice. I'm glad you shared that. One of the things that we've learned just from doing these podcasts, Samantha and I've learned that the terminology is really important. Um, have you experienced that, like, change in terminology over the years since you've been working with this organization?
You mean how people talk about suicide to reframe
Yeah,
it, make it less
died. I mean,
dramatic?
the biggest one for me was I used to say committed suicide, and I've been corrected to say died by suicide, and it's very important to say that. So just the different types of terminology and just being very frank about what what took place instead of, I mean, when we first started it, and even Zach, who's our producer, will share, is, we were really afraid to even say the word, it's just like,
Uh-huh.
things like that. So it's kind of like use of terminology, and when you go out and speak to other people about the organization, do you have like certain terminology that's really important?
Yeah, no, we try to do exactly what you say. We try to say died by suicide, but it's very interesting. I think it is really hard for people to say the word suicide. It does not flow off people's tongues. I have a bigger problem with the way media presents mental illness and
Mhm.
suicide. I mean, I'm sure you're very tuned into this, but as a survivor, it's
Mhm.
hard to turn on a movie or a show that you aren't sometimes hit like
Yeah.
and triggered because of and it's not an important part of the movie necessarily. It's almost gratuitous, right? um,
Mhm.
and it's just kind of thrown in for the shock factor. And so I think in some ways we've desensitized people to suicide. At the same time, we're not talking about it. So I want to create a list for survivors of safe movies to watch that don't have any suicide in them, because it's hard to find them, and especially when it's raw. People just can't go to the movies. They can't go and just be carefree because they're afraid of that topic coming up and kind of hitting them in the face when they're trying to give
Well,
themselves a little R&R.
that recently happened to Samantha, and spoiler alert, but it was the biggest movie last year, Stars Born.
Absolutely.
And it was just, she actually called me afterwards and was like, "You can't go see that movie." I actually watched the movie at home because I'm in Los Angeles, and my producer had the he was kind enough to give me the screener, and I knew when to walk away. And so I walked away and did not watch that part of the movie.
Yeah, it was
And
very graphic. It was very
yeah,
clear.
it was
Yeah.
very graphic, and that's what I understood. This also brings up another point, is that, have you had any experience with suicide contagion? Because one of the things that I have started reading a lot about since we started this was suicide contagion, the good and the bad. And there was an interesting article that I read in the New York Times about, and it came out, I think it was in 2014, the week that Robin Williams took his life. And
Yes.
it talks about the media and how we have, how they're dealing with this, and how that, especially when celebrities, copycats, or things of that sort, and that contagion is a real phenomenon. And one of the things that I actually liked that the article said was they talk about Kurt Cobain suicide in 1994, and for some reason the media that was surrounding that, they really discussed a lot of the pain that the family went through. So now they have the research and the data from back in 1994 that the hotline calls went up and suicides actually went down after
That's
Kurt Cobain
nice.
death, because of the way they dealt with it. So I do think media is a really big issue, and that's why getting this out there and talking about more is really important. But have you dealt with suicide contagion within the community and within, like, groups, these
Very
groups?
lucky. I have to tell you, we've been very lucky that I only know of 2 suicides in the history of the group. That's
Wow.
pretty amazing when you realize who we're working with. And you've been in some of those groups, so you know some
Yes.
people have been pretty vulnerable, been in
Hmm.
some pretty tough places, and they're free to talk about that there. I think it's how we talk about the suicide, and I think you said it perfectly. If they sensationalize it,
Hmm.
or if they try to give glib reasons why it happens versus framing it and talking about most suicides don't have to happen if people can get plugged into the kind of help that they need and offer those resources and talk to the families who've been left behind. There has been a really wonderful thing that has happened, probably I would say in the last 18 months, is that the media after suicides is reaching out to my organization now more. It used to just be talking about suicide prevention. Now they want to know the stories of those who've been left behind. That has gratified me a great deal. Number one, because they're finally beginning to recognize that there is a huge impact on those left behind. And for me, I also believe, and you get this because of what you're doing with the podcast, I try to prepare people to be able to be those people that can go before the media and talk about their loss. Because I know when they can do that, as hard as it is, it's going to help them heal.